partir. La privacidad y la seguridad son la clave en esta conferencia, donde todos tienen su llave. Desde cada rincón la comunidad se activa con ideas brillantes, la innovación se aviva. 5 días, las mentes se conectarán. Zcash unificado, juntos se explorarán. Como va de guía, la interacción es real. ZconV, evento que marca el ideal. En el mundo virtual nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV. El conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer. La privacidad y la seguridad son la clave en esta conferencia, donde todos tienen su llave. Desde cada rincón la comunidad se activa con ideas brillantes, la innovación se aviva. 5 días, las mentes se conectarán. Zcash unificado, juntos se explorarán. Como va de guía, la interacción es real. ZconV, evento que marca el ideal. En el mundo virtual nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV. El conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer. La privacidad y la seguridad son la clave en esta conferencia, donde todos tienen su llave. Desde cada rincón la comunidad se activa con ideas brillantes, la innovación se aviva. 5 días, las mentes se conectarán. Zcash unificado, juntos se explorarán. Como va de guía, la interacción es real. ZconV, evento que marca el ideal.
I'm Peter Van Valkenburg. I'm the
En
Director
el
of
mundo
Research.
virtual nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV. El conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer.
About how cryptocurrencies knowledge rather than bad policies and regulations. Hi, I'm Peter Van Valkenburg. I'm also on the board of directors of the Zcash Foundation. Since the beginning of the Zcash Foundation, Andrew Miller and I were some of the original members of that board. And for disclosure purposes, just to, squash any potential allegations of conflicts of interest, I feel like I should also say that I do advise the Starkware company on public policy issues. So that's me. Why am I here? Sorry, I have to get over this. I'm used to live performance, testifying in front of Congress and things like that. And when I'm staring into a camera with no feedback, I start to get a little nervous. Why am I here? Well, one of the amazing techs who's helping us, put on these meetings for this virtual conference was saying that they think that I have talked at every ZCon thus far, and that is almost true. I did not speak at the most recent ZCon. So the last time I gave a talk or was on a panel was in Las Vegas in 2022. And there was something, at least for me, extraordinary about that ZCon at Las Vegas. It was the first one after COVID. And so it was finally like amazing to see people face to face again. I hadn't even seen like Zuko or Jack at all, for years at that point. And it was just so heartening to see my friends again and people who are working on these important technologies. But it was also important and extraordinary because it was during, I think, the second day of that conference that a part of the US government, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, which we call OFAC, which is a division of the US Treasury, announced that Tornado Cash, and they weren't very specific, they just said Tornado Cash, is a sanctioned entity. And therefore, Americans are no longer allowed to use Tornado Cash. I'm fairly certain that everyone in the audience will know what Tornado Cash is, but I'll briefly just say it. It is a smart contract-based application on the Ethereum blockchain that uses the very same zero-knowledge cryptography developed for Zcash in order to create privacy functionality on Ethereum for people who want to escape the tyranny of a sort of constant public ledger of all of your financial transactions that your nosy next door neighbor can look at, and that so can anyone else, with or without a warrant, with or without suspicion of a crime, with or without any good reason to know the details of your financial life. And so Tornado Cash to me is an important project. It was an attempt at bringing the technologies that we developed here in Zcash to a chain that has computation, the ability to make custom assets, and obviously also to the second largest chain, I believe, by market capitalization of all the cryptocurrencies. And sanctioning Tornado Cash was an extraordinary measure. And I'll get into that as we go through my talk today. It's also an important thing to know a lot about and keep in mind, because if they can sanction Tornado Cash, there's a very real argument. I don't think it's a good argument, but there's a very real argument that they could try and sanction the Zcash protocol as a whole. There's not too many differences. I mean, Zcash is a layer 1, and it is the cumulative work of all the people running the software and connecting with each other on a peer-to-peer network that makes that service work. Tornado Cash is a decentralized app on Ethereum, and it is the cumulative effort of all the people running the Ethereum protocol that makes that work. But the Ethereum protocol writ large doesn't do what Tornado Cash does. It's just this discrete series of named smart contract addresses that do what Tornado Cash does. So there's a somewhat easier way to sanction a discrete series of smart contract addresses, the Tornado Cash pool addresses, than to just say the Zcash protocol in the abstract. But if you carefully listen to what the government says when it argues in favor of sanctions against Tornado Cash, what it's saying is we can basically sanction any series of intellectual properties that are being used by people to do things that we don't want them to do, like to protect their privacy. So this is both interesting to me. I'm trained as a lawyer, and I am a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer, dear listener, however many of you there are. I wish I could see you. So do not rely on anything I say as legal advice. I am not representing you, and this is a talk for information purposes so we can better understand as a community what the public policy landscape looks like. But I am a lawyer. I work at Coin Center, where we advocate for our mission, which is to defend the freedom to innovate. And so the sanctions were interesting and sort of activating for me, because it was a huge legal question that was being developed that would have big ramifications for the technologies that I'm sort of sworn to defend. It's also, though, very important, even if you're not an egghead lawyer like me, if you're an egghead software developer or something like that, even if you're not working on Tornado Cash, because these precedents that will be set in the cases I'm about to describe, and with regard to the Tornado Cash sanctions starting last 2022, will potentially be binding on you. So to the extent someone is accused today of conspiracy to violate sanctions by virtue of writing Tornado Cash software, it is not unfathomable, and it might even be alarmingly possible, that somebody could be accused of conspiracy to violate sanctions for developing Zcash software. So with that as sort of throat clearing, like why am I here? I'll just kind of go through my presentation. I want to invite all of you who are listening to be really active. If you have even a notion of a question, and certainly if you have a firmly formed question in your mind, please put it into the chat, because I want to make this in many ways an update on what's happened since my talk at Las Vegas and the announcement of the sanctions against Tornado Cash. And I want this to be sort of a community forum where people can, get the answers to their uncertainties about what's going to happen next and what are the implications. So please be active and put your questions under your session on WOVA. WOVA? WOVA? WOVA. Okay, so first of all, what are sanctions laws? I want to give just a very brief, for information purposes, background on what we're talking about. Sanctions laws, all different countries have sanctions laws. I'm going to be talking about U.S. sanctions laws, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which I'll call IEEPA, I-E-E-P-A. And you might say, and you'd be right, well, this is an international community. Why are you focused on U.S. sanctions laws? Well, for one, it's U.S. sanctions laws that are being used to target software development of zero-knowledge proof tech. So already this is sort of something larger than a parochial U.S. interest. But second, not being a U.S. person or not residing in the U.S. doesn't mean you're safe here, sadly. In fact, there's recently, I think you can Google it, the liability for sanctions internationally tri-seal report or tri-seal announcement. Tri-seal meaning 3 different agencies, as DOJ, Treasury, and a third. I'm not actually sure. I just found this the other day. There's a whole report about how it's not specific to crypto, about how sanctions apply in many cases. Liability for sanctions, failure to obey sanctions, applies to non-U.S. persons in a lot of contexts. And one of the big contexts is when somebody is helping an American violate sanctions laws in any way, effectively. There's a little bit more legal language in the Tri-Seal Declaration that was issued, but that's what it boils down to. And so even though I'm talking exclusively about U.S. sanctions in this talk, this is definitely something that it doesn't matter if you're a U.S. person or if you visit the U.S., even if you just stay in, say, Singapore all the time, it's still relevant to you because of the so-called long arm of U.S. jurisdiction. Great, I've already got a question. Are there resources for developers to try to mitigate the risk of merely participating in a privacy-preserving protocol? I'd like to think of this talk as a valuable information resource, but I have to have this disclosure because we're talking about really serious things. You should probably have a lawyer. You should definitely have a lawyer if you're actively engaged in any kind of heavy-duty maintenance of a protocol that does these things. I wish that wasn't the case, because I think, especially in the US, but also in other nations that are quote-unquote open societies, you have a right to publish software without prior restraint. And as long as you're not advocating for people to use that software to break the law, which I suspect nobody here is doing, that right is pretty rock solid. Unfortunately, if you look at the case right now that's being brought against the Tornado Cash developers in the Southern District of New York, which I'll go through in this talk, the government doesn't seem to agree with those First Amendment arguments, and basically says that simply by publishing software to GitHub repositories and paying for Amazon Web Services, a place to host a user interface, which is still software, and we're at pains to remind the government about that, you are somehow on the hook potentially for conspiracy to violate sanctions laws. So this is pretty real and pretty heavy duty. And so if you're doing things like hosting content, hosting software, like paying for AWS, you should definitely have a lawyer. And if you are just, publishing your own, pull requests or updates to repositories that are involved in the protocol or wallets or things like that, unfortunately, you still should probably talk to a lawyer about your risk exposure. And I know lawyers are expensive. I work at a nonprofit, and I'm expensive even on nonprofit price levels, and I know that the private sector is a lot more expensive. So I wish I had something better to tell you, but the best resource for you if you're actively involved in maintaining these technologies is a lawyer who is your lawyer. So you need to be in a representation type relationship with that person. I can't tell you to rely on the statements I'm giving in this talk. This is more about just getting the community to know, where we all stand with regards to the legal risks here in general. Your specific legal risks you need to discuss with somebody who is duty bound to represent your interests. And this is a lot of work for more lawyers. I swear I'm not just, a member of the legal bar who's trying to get all of my friends rich or something. I wish this wasn't happening, but it is. So the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, which is US sanctions laws. Under that statute from Congress, which goes back decades, it actually goes back about a century. It was started off as the Trading with the Enemy Act, a little bit more aggressive sounding. Historically, it was a wartime power, trading with the enemy, and then it became an emergency power, International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that the president is able to use to affect important foreign policy objectives. It's supposed to be about foreign policy. It's not supposed to be about domestic policy, like telling Americans which technologies they can and cannot use. And that's one of many reasons why it's being abused in the Tornado Cash context. Under IEPA, the president, through the Treasury Secretary, who can also delegate this power further within the Treasury agency to the head of the Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, they promulgate a list. We call it the SDN list, the Specially Designated Nationals list of people and property of those people. And basically, in the simple and more benign and probably good use of these sanctions powers, OFAC will add to that list the name of a known terrorist, say Osama bin Laden, who, now that I bring it up, I've never checked if Osama bin Laden was on the OFAC list by name, but I'm pretty sure he almost certainly was. And what that means is if your name is on the list or the properties that you own, so say he owned a cave in Afghanistan that had an address, if your name or your addresses are on that list, Americans are bound by law to not engage in financial transactions, in any transactions really, with that named person or the property of that named person. And this list has grown extensively over the century or so that sanctions have been a power that the president has. And in many ways, just summarized, to avoid going through a whole dissertation of the history of sanctions power, it's become probably the primary tool for geopolitical control that the US exerts internationally. And this is for obvious reasons, because the alternative, conventional warfare, and certainly nuclear warfare, is incredibly costly in lives and in potential, world destruction in the case of nuclear warfare. And so, given that reality, the usage of the tool to systematically blockade and starve the economy of our enemies through sanctions is the power that we have and the power that we use. So these are really serious laws. And when used well, I won't necessarily defend them, because unfortunately, I think, and this is a whole nother subtopic, the people harmed by sanctions in a sanctioned country, tend to be the poorer people, the disenfranchised people who just their livelihoods are already on the edge, and now because their economy is under sanction, they're going to make even less money and have even less money to feed their families and things like that. So it's still a really aggressive policy, and there's a lot of good questions to be asked about whether the leaders actually suffer that much, because they can usually find ways through these blockades, if you will, and still enjoy their disgusting expropriation of wealth from their populations, their palaces, and their fast cars and yachts and things. That said, it's certainly true that if Russian oligarchs are going to buy boats off the backs of their oppressed people, we should be able to seize and block those luxury yacht transactions. Like, I do think there's a place for sanctions when used appropriately. So, what are the limits of sanctions laws? Sanctions laws described generally are you curate this list, and Americans are not allowed to engage in transactions with people or property on that list. The limits to sanctions laws are another category of laws that generally are referred to as the Berman Amendments, Berman, named after Howard Berman, who was the California Democrat in Congress who pushed for these amendments to sanctions laws, and a subsequent law called the Free Trade in Ideas Act. The Berman Amendments and the Free Trade in Ideas Act were a response from Congress to how the president was using sanctions laws. Congress didn't come out and say, we don't like sanctions laws, get rid of them. Congress came out and said, we're worried that America is an open society. We're not worried about that. We like that. And we're worried that the president is using, or rather abusing, these sanction powers to effectively close off our society, to say that Americans can't buy art or magazines or read books by Cuban authors, a sanctioned country, or by Iranian authors. And sanctions are supposed to harm the foreign regime that is hurting its people and starve it of resources. Sanctions are not supposed to shut down the free exchange of ideas and information and cut off Americans from access to those important ideas, even if those ideas are bad. Doing that would effectively mean that sanctions violate our First Amendment rights to freely exchange information and buy and sell information as well. This isn't just like nonprofit pamphlets and things. This is broadcasts of sporting events happening in Cuba are some of the formative cases here, very profitable broadcasts. And so Howard Berman and the other members of Congress who passed these amendments and laws said, we need to clearly circumscribe the sanction powers and forbid the president from directly or indirectly prohibiting Americans from engaging in information transactions. And the reason why there's two laws here, the Berman Amendments and then the Free Trade and Ideas Act, is because the first time we did this, the president still, or rather the Secretary of Treasury and OFAC under them, they still kept sanctioning information. And they got around this congressional prohibition on those kinds of sanctions by saying, oh, well, you identified photographs and books and lithographs, but this is a radio broadcast. It's different. And so Congress had to come back in the FTIA, the Free Trade and Ideas Act, and say, we mean you cannot prohibit any information transactions, regardless of the medium or type of information. Like we're not playing around here. Stop trying to continue to violate their First Amendment rights. We're gonna buttress those First Amendment rights for Americans by passing this further law, the Free Trade and Ideas Act. And you couldn't ask for a clearer title as to what the law is supposed to be doing. I'm gonna pause here and look at this question. I've seen online comments from some influential Ethereum developers saying they felt that Zcash leadership was dismissive and unsupportive of Tornado Cash devs. Have you received that feedback yourself? What can we do as a community to defend ourselves and other developers? This is a touchy one. I've seen some of these fights. I think there is a little bit of too much aggression probably on both sides, some of the Ethereum devs and some of the Zcash devs, over the privacy pools proposal that Amin and Vitalik and others have put forward. So to not go into too much detail about that, the way I see the debate is this important question about whether, you should have a right to privacy no matter what, or whether a social graph can exclude you from their anonymity set and therefore, in some ways, by sort of voting with their feet, deny you privacy. Because that is a way of thinking of privacy pools. Privacy pools work very much like Tornado Cash, except because of the amazing capabilities of zero knowledge proofs, individual people, before putting their funds in the pool, can basically choose who they want to be in the pool with them, to be in the anonymity set with them, and who they don't want in the anonymity set. The idea being that if there was an obvious address joining the anonymity set that had hacked a bunch of DeFi projects and was highly likely to be a North Korean cyber intelligence unit trying to launder those hacks and finance a nuclear weapons program, I should be able to not mix with those people, if you will. Again, it's not mixing, and every time I say that, I know I'm giving fodder to our enemies who say, oh, it's a mixer, all the funds are commingled. Well, no, in zero knowledge proof systems, you get the funds you put in and you're not allowed to get anything else. That's neither here nor there. But that is to say that there is a hard question here, right? And I think it's a very important and very good question to have vigorous debate about. And I lament the fact that sometimes those debates online, because this is the way the online works, which is why I'm particularly sad we're not having an in-person conference, although I think it's the right choice given travel constraints and budget issues and things like that. But some of those debates online have spilled over into sort of more personal attacks. And I think it might be the animosity surrounding those debates that is being portrayed by some or interpreted as some as Zcash folks being dismissive of the Tornado Cash devs. I, for one, I don't know the Tornado Cash devs personally. Coin Center has filed an amicus brief in the court case against Roman Storm in the Southern District of New York and Roman Semenov. And in our amicus, we make, I think, the most vigorous arguments we can possibly make that the government is horribly abusing its prosecutorial powers here and wrongly accusing these developers of crimes that they didn't commit. And so personally, I'm trying to do everything I can to help Roman Storm, at least, because I know U.S. law. Alexei Perksev, who is being prosecuted in the Netherlands, I would like to offer my assistance as well, although I don't want to mess things up. I don't know Dutch law. It's a very different area of law, so I'm limited to how much I can help, but I feel solidarity with him. He was kept in jail for months without charges, which in the US would be a scandal. You're not allowed to hold people that long without charging them. Anyway, so that gets to that sort of community to community aid and sometimes animosity. We all have very strong opinions. And I just would put out a general call that hopefully we can stay as civil as possible and realize when we have common interests. And with regard to Tornado Cash, Zcash, and Ethereum have 100% common interests. With regard to like what Ethereum devs want to build next, whether it's privacy pools or some other iteration of Tornado Cash, maybe we don't have always the same opinion, but we can have civil discussions about that and hopefully maintain our solidarity on the things that really matter. I'm going to go to the next question because this is going well. In April 2021, OFAC sanctioned a Zcash address they claim belonged to Russian entities alleged to have interfered with U.S. elections. I'm not aware of that. That's very interesting. I'm going to look that up now. Could a miner who included a transaction to or from that address in a Zcash block be persecuted for sanctions violations? If you are that miner, dear friend who has submitted a comment here, you should find a lawyer and do not rely on the statements I'm about to say. However, for information purposes, talking generally about miners and sanctions. And I actually had a section of my talk where I wanted to discuss this, so this is perfect. Zcash is an interesting protocol with regards to miners and their compliance obligations. So we have transparent addresses, T addresses, and we have shielded addresses, Z addresses. And this might be an important area for me to get clarification from one of the actual developers of the protocol, because I'm a lawyer, not a software developer, though I think I understand these technologies quite well. For a lawyer, it's like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Transparent addresses, the mining validation of transactions in order to create the block is, I suspect, very similar, if not identical, because we're a fork of Bitcoin to Bitcoin, right? And so when you make your block header, you choose which transactions from T addresses you're putting in the block. So if that sanctioned address is a T address, if you were a miner, would be able to go to the SDN list, which is the sanctions list, and periodically download it and check to see if there's any T addresses on that list. And as you do your work as a miner, whenever you build block headings, you just never put in any transactions from that address. Are you obligated to do that under US law? Well, the first question is, are you a US person or not a US person? This is not a decisive question because, as I said, this tri-seal declaration has recently sort of pushed the issue of how broad is US jurisdiction over this issue to the fore, and there's a lot of arguable points there. Someone might say, well, you just don't have jurisdiction over me. I'm a German national doing my own business. Everything I do complies with German law. What the hell, America? Stay away from me. I'm just mining a blockchain. But you might lose on that. I don't know. Depends on how strong this extraterritorial jurisdiction is in the context of assisting Americans to violate sanctions laws, which is how they're going to argue your activities fit into their jurisdiction. If you are an American, you should definitely have a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, a lawyer that specializes in sanctions. I would, if I was that lawyer, advise you to block those transactions. And what we're finding with Bitcoin miners in the US generally is that seems to be like serious Bitcoin miners who are based in the US seem to be getting that advice from their lawyers, because what we're seeing is pretty systematic non-inclusion of sanctioned addresses within the Bitcoin block headers. And I have trouble arguing for any other outcome. And this is a big part of the reason why I think it's a big problem for blockchains to have base layer publicity, to not have base layer privacy. Because if these technologies are supposed to be neutral infrastructure, which is not illegal to build, it is not illegal to build neutral infrastructure for people to use for good things that they want to do with their lives. You don't have to spy on people in order to build a financial system if you're not actually a trusted entity in that financial system. And that's a huge, and if somebody wants to argue that I'm condoning illegal activity by arguing for building neutral financial systems, then I want them to bring a prosecution against me, because that's deeply cynical, totalitarian, and it goes against everything I believe America stands for, and I'm actually pretty patriotic about my country. So that's the reality with mining and public blockchains. Now, things are more interesting with Zcash and Monero and some of the other L1s that have privacy features, in that it may be impossible to do that with regard to shielded transactions. And that's a protocol intensive question. Like I'm not going to stretch my knowledge to say that it's impossible to do it, but that's kind of the point, is that these transactions don't leave a public they'll leave a public trace, aside from the validity of the transaction being something you can check because of the zero knowledge proof. And again, it's not illegal, it's not a crime to build neutral public infrastructure for people to use for their own legitimate purposes. And so it shouldn't also be a crime to run that infrastructure like a miner who's validating shielded pool transactions is doing, even if they have no ability to know the salient details of those transactions. So that's me on mining. And to some extent, I will say this is a real advantage of Zcash in our future information and public policy landscape. I think it's quite possible that as sanctions become increasingly used and sometimes abused by national authorities, that the Bitcoin blockchain will basically, its throughput will be continually reduced. And I'm not saying, oh, what a shame that Bitcoin miners in America can't process a terrorist's transactions and put them in the blockchain. I'm not saying that. I am saying that what if you had liability under Chinese laws for processing the transactions of dissidents in Western China, Uyghurs who are just trying to get money out of the country to their families who have already left to avoid losing their cultural heritage. That is a transaction that a miner in China should put in the blockchain, even though it probably violates Chinese laws. And that's a transaction that hopefully an American miner would put in the blockchain, even if the US government happened to develop a friendlier relationship with China than we currently have and say Americans shouldn't process these transactions for Uyghurs either. It's like, how dare you? Anyway, mining. Okay, I've got another question. A significant portion of the indictment. So this indictment is the questioner is asking, I think, about the Tornado Cash indictment against Roman Storm and Roman Semenov, which came around, gosh, half a year ago now. So a while after the sanctions came in place, the U.S. government, which had originally said in those sanctions, we are not sanctioning any of the developers of the protocol or the members of the Torn Token DAO or the users of the protocol. We are just sanctioning the protocol. But then subsequently, they came back and said, all right, not only are we, well, they're sanctioning one of them, the non-US person. They're not sanctioning Roman Storm because it's illegal to use US sanction laws to sanction a US person because it would be a deprivation of due process rights. You'd be accusing them of a crime effectively and punishing them, blocking them from engaging in financial transactions with other Americans without a trial. And that's why it's manifestly unconstitutional for the US to use sanction powers to sanction American citizens and US residents. And it's kind of an insidious aspect of sanctions law that works. We seem to be perfectly fine doing these very aggressive things to foreign persons without a trial, but we won't do it to our own citizens without a trial. But that's neither here nor there. So a significant portion of the indictment, oh, sorry, I was describing the indictment. I tend to go off in a lot of tangents. So they sanctioned Semenov, who's, I believe, a Russian national. They didn't sanction Roman Storm, but they accused both and co-conspirators who are not named, but almost certainly are Alexei Perksov, who's already being tried at this point in the Netherlands. They accused the two Romans of conspiracy to launder money, conspiracy to do unlicensed money transmission, and conspiracy to violate sanctions laws. So they're not sanctioned themselves, although Semenov is separately, but they're helping people violate sanctions laws. So a significant portion of that indictment that made those accusations was focused on the fact that Tornado Cash founders were profiting via Torn tokens. If the founders had been completely anon and not run the UI, additional services, how do you think that would have affected the strength of the charges? There's some interesting sort of divergent factual questions there. I want to come out and say that I don't believe that being anonymous is a good way to protect yourself as a developer. I understand the desire to be anonymous, but you shouldn't have to be anonymous to be in a country that obeys the rule of law and fundamental human rights and publish software. You should be able to be yourself 100%, whoever you are, whatever your beliefs, prejudices, religion, gender identity, you should just be able to be that and publish software. Because if you're not doing other things, if you're not advocating for the criminal usage of that software, you're creating research, you're creating science and technology that has ubiquitous applications, the vast majority of which are good for human flourishing. And if we think that the only people who should be allowed to do that are people who hide in the shadows, then we're fucked as a country. So being anon might be a pragmatic way to keep doing these things in a hostile regulatory environment, but it's messed up. It goes against all the things I believe America should stand for. And it doesn't mean that somehow you're not potentially guilty of crimes if the government thinks you're guilty of crimes. And if anything, it's going to make it easier for the government in some ways, if they do catch you, to prove that you were guilty of crimes, because there will be this perception that, oh, well, if they were doing nothing wrong, they wouldn't have hid in the shadows. but look, they took all these steps to hide their activity from the government, so clearly they must have been doing something wrong, right? Even if they weren't doing anything wrong. That's what they're going to argue. And so much more important than being anon or not being anon is, what are you doing? In this country, in the US, I firmly believe that if all you're doing is publishing open source software that anybody is free to use for any purpose, and it's infrastructure software, it creates neutral private financial infrastructure, I think you have a watertight First Amendment defense. Again, you should talk to your own lawyer if you want to rely on that statement. But if that's not what the First Amendment stands for, then we're in big trouble as a country, because the world is run by software. And if people can't just write software that does certain things because it's their deeply held beliefs that software should do those things, then people are just not going to engage in the productive and technological and socially beneficial activity of building new things in the world. And that's sort of the end of progress, the exchange of ideas and freedom. Now, the question also mentions, a lot of the indictment is focused on the fact that TC founders were profiting via torn tokens. And you're right. There's various reasons for that in the indictment and in the motions that have been submitted by the government to support its indictment. The biggest reason for that is not the sanctions charge, it's the unlicensed money transmission charge. And I won't go into a whole description of unlicensed money transmission here, but the definition of money transmission, for which you then need to get a license before you do it, says engages as a business in transferring currency or currency substitutes from one location to another, or one person to another. And so profitability definitely informs whether you're engaged in this activity as a business or not. That said, with regard to the unlicensed money transmission charge, I think the government's wrong, because FinCEN, the relevant regulator for licensing money transmission, has said since 2013, at least, that you need to actually accept and transmit something on behalf of another, which means controlling it, at least for a transient point in time. And that if you actually have no control over the assets that the software you've designed is moving, then you can't be a money transmitter. So set that aside. The sanctions charges and profiting from torn tokens. Also, by the way, the price of torn tokens plummeted like 8-fold, I think, as it became clear that North Korea was using Tornado Cash, or was probably using Tornado Cash. We don't know for certain. I think that the Lazarus Group is North Korea, though we're pretty sure they are. And so it's pretty clear they didn't profit off of the use of their protocol by sanctioned persons. It's pretty clear that they actually lost tons of money because the protocol stopped being used as much. No matter what, the torn token price was just deplorable, and so it's a question whether they even profited. That said, sanctions laws exempt information transactions. This was my description of the Berman Amendments. And it's very clear in the Berman Amendments and the Free Trade and Ideas Act that Congress meant to forbid the president and the executive branch from sanctioning transactions in information, commercial or non-commercial. And that's actually in the statute. So you're allowed to make money off of these information transactions, as long as they're just information transactions. There's a harder question whether all of the things you're doing as a software developer are information, and whether you're actually engaged in conduct, like regulatable conduct, like helping people do things by knowing them, knowing their particular needs, and satisfying their needs. And especially if that person you're helping is a criminal, then there's a very real possibility that you're not just publishing software, you're engaged in person-to-person conduct to facilitate an illegal end, or say sanctions evasion. But that's not what's alleged in the indictment. They basically say just publishing the Tornado Cash protocol to the GitHub repository and running the software on an AWS server is itself conduct that we can regulate, and goes beyond information transactions. So I think that's why there is this focus on the profitability of torn tokens, which was actually not profitable, is the unlicensed money transmission claim. It could come up in the sanctions discussion, although, as I said, the Free Trade and Ideas Act and the Berman Amendments, they don't discriminate. If it's an information transaction, it doesn't matter if you're doing it for profit or non-profit. Got another question. At what level of contributing software to the Zcash community should a developer think seriously about retaining a lawyer? Developing a wallet, working on shared libraries, hosting a Zcash node, or light wallet server? I'm going to give an unsatisfying answer. I want you all to check in with a lawyer because I don't want anyone hurt here. And frankly, if you're doing some of those lightweight things, those things that we think are not like a heavy level of contributing to the Zcash community, you're a great case to vindicate rights, right? It's like, are you serious? All I do is contribute to a widely used shared software library that is used in Zcash, but is also used in like NSA grade encryption for the government. Like, are you serious? You're going to come at me? Those kinds of plaintiffs are, I think, important, or those kinds of people are important to vindicate our rights if it ever came to it. Now, you might not be at a high likelihood of being prosecuted because the government doesn't want to prosecute people that it thinks it will lose its prosecution against. But there may be an opportunity for you to apply for declarative judgment, which is something you could talk with a lawyer about in your home jurisdiction. Say, like, we see what's happening in the SDNY. I want to know that I'm not doing something that's a crime. And I think I can sue the government to vindicate my rights. So that's another reason to talk to a lawyer, even if you don't think there's a likelihood of prosecution against you. From your perspective, it will be better for Zcash to get rid of transparent transaction. No, I don't think so. I think it provides flexibility, acknowledging that there are view keys, so you can basically get the effect of a transparent transaction with view keys. I do think that transparent addresses afford heavily regulated entities really obvious and clear compliance steps that they've already learned in the context of Bitcoin. And so if we deprecated those addresses, it's possible that it'd be impossible to find a regulated entity that would transact in Zcash, which would cut off a lot of on and off ramps to this important technology for financial privacy. So that's my personal opinion. I don't feel very strongly about that because, as I said, you could affect something similar with view keys, although worry whether heavily regulated institutions would spend the time and money to build a compliance program around view keys when they already had one about transparent addresses. But that's my general opinion on that. I don't think that it creates particularly strong public policy ramifications one way or the other. It's not like this miners censoring transaction address issue is deadly to the protocol. It might be to protocols like Bitcoin that only have transparent addresses. Although that's a big thing to say because Bitcoin, I like Bitcoin. I'm not saying something mean about Bitcoin. It's the original community and the biggest community by far from a cryptocurrency standpoint. So they're probably pretty resilient, right? The fact that U.S. persons and presumably entities may not be sanctioned seems important given that ECC and ZF are U.S. entities. Yes. This is one reason why when I think it was Andrew Miller who first approached me about joining the Zcash Foundation as a board member, I was like, I don't do this. As I said, I'm an advisor for Starkware. My day job, my main job is Coin Center, public policy. I don't go out and, join a lot of boards and do a lot of, contract work in the cryptocurrency space because I'm risk averse, and I think it's important to pick the right things that you want to champion with your finite time on this earth, right? And so one of my main certainties when Andrew Miller came to me about how I would or would not do this was, I'm only going to do this if it's a US-based nonprofit dedicated to publishing software for financial privacy. Because yes, that means that if they tried to sanction the Zcash Foundation, they'd be sanctioning a wholly owned nonprofit US organization with all of the constitutional rights that accompany being that US resident organization and nonprofit for that matter. And so we could say, like, there's no due process here. You didn't accuse this organization of criminal behavior. You can't just put us on a list that forbids Americans from transacting with us. We have to go to a trial, have a judge, a neutral magistrate, a process of appeal, representation by counsel, Sixth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Fourth Amendment issues are at stake. First Amendment issues are hugely at stake, our freedom of speech. Because what do? We publish software that express our deeply held viewpoints that privacy and financial infrastructure neutrality matter. And so, yes, it is important that some of the entities in this space are US entities, I think, because not just because that changes whether or not they can be sanctioned. I think it also changes what kind of arguments they can make if accused of sanctions violations or if accused of money laundering. We can make these First Amendment arguments and say, take a hike. The US Constitution says that my rights here are robust. Do you think governments might increase their regulatory pressure to levels that might see Zcash wallets removed from app stores? And if that happens, what would be the path to follow? This question reminds me of another question, so I'll address both of them. I think you get pressure to remove Zcash wallets from app stores, and you get pressure to delist Zcash on cryptocurrency exchanges and other centralized financial institution platforms. I don't want to see this happen. I think America and freedom and the things that I like in the world, I think my kids will be better off if Americans are given a choice about their financial privacy, and that choice isn't forced upon them by exerting pressure on a choke point, a big corporation who cares about the profitability of their business more than the rights of the users that it services. So I'm not defending that. But at the same time, if the electronic cash for the internet that we're building still relies on choke points, we haven't built the right electronic cash. And so what happens? My guess is we struggle because normal users expect to be able to get access to these things through the comfortable mechanisms like app stores and banks that they've used in the past. And it's going to be hard to get users to use something even more decentralized. But what would be the path to follow? The path is to further decentralize. Like, again, if your electronic cash relies on corporate choke points, you built the wrong electronic cash in some way. Cool. Got 10 minutes left. I might end it there and give you back your time if you don't have more questions, because I think we've covered a lot. Great. Got a question. What about your thoughts on the new exchange address type made for Binance? What are your thoughts on this, and what do you think of its adequacy? I'm from Firo, who proposed these addresses, and we are seeing restrictions being lifted from Binance on the 4 European countries we were originally banned in. I understand you're not an EU lawyer, but just from your gut feeling and understanding on MiCA. Oh, no. I asked for another question, and I'm afraid I don't know enough about either the exchange addresses at Binance or MiCA to give a good answer here, and I don't want to send you down the wrong path. Okay, next question. There is strong support for forced inclusion lists, EIP 7547, in the upcoming Ethereum upgrade. The rationale is it would give block builders plausible deniability for including sanctioned transactions, since excluding them would prevent the creation of valid blocks. This seems to distribute the regulatory risk across the whole Ethereum validator network, wondering what the legal implications are. That's very interesting. In general, I think we need more approaches like 7547. I think we should be having more serious conversations in the public blockchain space about encrypting the mempool. Now, maybe I've said something foolish and Dara or somebody is going to tell me that you can't do that without encrypting everything like Zcash. But, you know, we need better answers to this, because base layer neutrality is sort of the assumed nature of blockchain networks. And without base layer neutrality, I'm not sure they're all that valuable as compared to a more permissioned financial system. I think the counter argument to finding ways to protect base layer neutrality by spreading the sort of regulatory surface area and creating quote unquote plausible deniability, the counter argument is, well, we just need at least a few jurisdictions around the world to remain open and liberal, and miners will hopefully in those jurisdictions continue to process transactions that have been wrongly blocked by oppressive authorities in other regions, and that will find an equilibrium. And I hope that's true. I think that's what supporters of Bitcoin even in light of the ramping up of sanctions, would say. I think that's a geopolitical incentive-based solution rather than a cryptographic solution. And cryptographic solutions seem to carry less possibility of failure than sort of geopolitical incentives or balancing type solutions to this problem. Also, I want to say one thing from, again, if you're a miner and you worry about these things, or a staker on Ethereum, if you're any kind of block validator, you should definitely have a lawyer, because you're engaged in probably some at least reasonably profitable activity, and you should use some of those profits to pay a lawyer. I guess what I would say is this: talk to your lawyer about things like willful blindness. You're not allowed to, if somebody goes to you and says, hey man, I really want some meth, but all I got is this Bitcoin and I need dollars to buy meth. Will you give me some Bitcoin, some dollars, so I can buy some meth, and I'll give you this Bitcoin? You cannot just stand there and go, la 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 la, I didn't hear meth, because you're still sort of culpable for that behavior. Now, obviously, this is a cartoon version of the question you're asking, because the question you're asking is much more nuanced. It's, we just mine the blocks on the protocol. The protocol sets rules. We have to follow those rules to engage in this business activity. We don't investigate, nor do we have any reason to know the details of the things we're doing to obey the protocol. If we didn't do the protocol, we would not do the mining and not get the reward. You have a much better argument that this isn't willful blindness. This is just obeying the rules of a computer system while doing information transactions, which are exempted from, plausibly are arguably exempted from IEPA, and therefore we're not culpable. All right, but this is why this is a gray area. I can't give you a firm answer here, and I'd be a bad lawyer and probably subject to disbarment if I told you that there was a clear answer here and you can rely on me. You cannot rely on me, so I'll leave it at that. So 5 minutes for my conclusion. I'll take less than that. My contact information is peter@coincenter.org. That's the email address I check most often. Coincenter.org is CoinCenter's website. All of our regulatory filings, all of our testimony in front of Congress, all of our blog posts and day-to-day updates on the state of public policy are available at coincenter.org. If this talk specifically has been interesting to you, I highly recommend you go to coincenter.org and find, it's one of our recent posts, a copy of our amicus brief in the Roman Semovich criminal prosecution, Tornado Cash prosecution. That is the document where we helped the court hopefully better understand sanctions laws, the Berman Amendment carve-outs for information transactions, and why it is wrong to try and hold Roman Storm and Semenov accountable for sanctions violations in light of the activities described in the indictment, which are pretty much limited to software development and publishing, and in light of the fact that the Berman Amendments carve out those types of transactions from the reach of sanctions prohibitions. I also want to put in a plug, if this talk is interesting to you and this aspect of sanctions law is interesting to you, to also read the excellent brief from the DeFi Education Fund in the same case, where they go into another area of sanctions laws, its past applications, to find that this is an unprecedented use of sanctions law. So that's another good legal brief to read, just to better understand the sanctions issues surrounding software development. Cool. Well, with that, I wish you all a good ZconV. Is that what we're calling it? That's something I should have known before starting this talk. And I will be in the wrap-up session, and I'm also going to be in a couple other sessions throughout the week. So thank you.
And we're live? Okay. 3, 2.
Well, hello everyone. This is Ian Sagstetter, formerly of the Electric Coin Company and of ZCub, in various just community member now. And we are here to record some short podcasts with various members of the Zcash community. We're calling this Zcon sessions, just some in-person recordings while we're all here together. Our first recording and guest will be Nick Wilcox.
Nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV, el conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer, la privacidad y la seguridad son la clave en esta conferencia donde todos tienen su llave. Desde cada rincón la comunidad se activa con ideas brillantes, la innovación se aviva. 5 días, las mentes se conectarán. Zcash unificado, juntos explorarán. Con boba de guía, interacciones reales. ZconV, evento que marca idea. En el mundo virtual nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV, el conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer, la privacidad y la seguridad son la clave en esta conferencia donde todos tienen su llave. Desde cada rincón la comunidad se activa con ideas brillantes, la innovación se aviva. 5 días, las mentes se conectarán. Zcash unificado, juntos explorarán. Con boba de guía, interacciones reales. ZconV, evento que marca idea. En el mundo virtual nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV, el conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer, la privacidad y la seguridad